I am so happy that so many of you are here and that so many of you actually know Frank from various parts of your
Past.
lives for many
Long
years.
past.
And so welcome everyone. It's just a great pleasure to have Frank Bidart with us today. And I'm going to ask him to read the poem that we're going to talk about, which is the title poem, Half Light, of his Pulitzer Prize winning collected poems. And one of the reasons Frank hasn't been on earlier is that it's been so hard to choose one of his poems to to for us to discuss because um all of the poems are so extraordinary, powerful and moving and have been certainly have been a very important part of my life because one of the great things about our my our friendship, my friendship with Frank, is that we've shared each other's poems. We've looked at each other's poems
That's for
uh,
a long
for
time.
for a very, very long time, at least 60 years.
Yes, at least.
And I could probably blackmail Frank because I still have
Oh
some of
no.
his old poems that he never wanted to publish.
Yeah.
And I even know where they are.
Well, one of the things one has to do is when you're a poet, you start immediately collecting things. And all my those first collections I put together were so terrible. But I didn't know they were terrible, but
So he says,
well, they were terrible. Believe me. Believe me, they were embarrassing.
I, his own worst critic.
Well,
Um, so welcome everyone. I'm so glad we have a wonderful group with us today.
have a quorum.
We do. We do. And I think let's start. Um, Frank, would you please read Half-Light?
Okay, I'll read Half Light. Um
And
I have the book in front of me.
I will hold up a, the copy of Frank's collected poems so you can see it. And if you don't own it, you should.
On page 603. Um, I hope everyone can read my anti-Trump t-shirt. Half Light. That crazy drunken night, I maneuvered you out into a field outside of Coachella. I'd never seen a sky so full of stars, as if the dirt of our lives still were sprinkled with the glistening white shells from the ancient seabed beneath us that receded long ago. Parallel. We lay in parallel furrows. That suffocated, fearful look on your face. Jim, yesterday I heard your wife on the phone tell me you died almost 9 months ago. Jim, now we cannot ever, bitter that we cannot ever have the conversation that in nature and alive we never had. Now, not ever. We have not spoken in years. I thought perhaps at 90 or 100, two broken down old men, we wouldn't give a damn. and fine speech when I tell you that all the years we were undergraduates, I was madly in love with you. You say you knew. I say, I knew you knew. You say, there was no place in nature we could meet. You say this as if you need me to admit something. No place in nature given our natures. Or is this warning? I say what is happening now is happening only because one of us is dead. You laugh and say, or both of us. Our words will be weirdly jolly. That light I now envy exists only on this page.
Thank you.
Uh,
Um, is there anything you would like to say about the poem before people start asking questions or
well, it's something that it's a night. This was very early in the years when Coachella was just getting started as a event that people went to, and it was not very far from Riverside, where we both lived, where Jim and I lived. We were undergraduates at the University of California, Riverside, and we had gone to Coachella. I can't remember now who we saw there, but this is about the ride back, which I've never forgotten. It was a night, as I say in the poem, so full of stars. I'd never seen a more star-filled night, and it was very memorable. I've been trying to write about that night since. I think this is the best version I've had of it.
oh, thanks. Um, first responses to the poem. What do you what are you feeling when you what did you feel when you read it for the first time? What do you feel listening to Frank read it?
Let me say that I mean I think it is a very common experience to have an attachment when you're very young, when you're in either high school or college, that never becomes explicit, that one way or another one never lets the other person know for perhaps good reasons and perhaps not good reasons. Um, and I think that's a subject that the poem uh, reminds people of. And it's not something that I think it's very common. I think, the one's feelings as an undergraduate, as a kid, are so unruly, are so they're not necessarily uh, uh, emotions that fit into the ways that one knows one is supposed to feel. And I think that's very common. And it's something that the poem, without realizing it, when I without realizing it at the time, that's something that has reminded lots of people of something in their own experience, some perhaps fleeting relationship that never came to the fore, and in a way I never quite realized how common it was until people started to talk about the poem.
Yeah, thanks. Um, again, I invite you to offer your first responses to the poem, or listening to it, or reading it.
I,
Well,
I'll jump in with something,
Jennifer,
Lloyd.
hi.
Um, just
I get
uh, along with everything that Frank just said about the poem, what I love, what almost makes me laugh out loud, is what happens in the last third and that movement at the end when it says, "You laugh and say, or both of us."
yeah,
This conversation is only happening because one of us is dead, and then, or both of us, and the
yeah,
words will be weirdly jolly. What's so interesting to me is the way the common experience that Frank describes of the memory of this kind of moment, and then the memory at many stages of life of not having had the conversation one wants to have,
yeah,
how that arrives in the poem, in the place of the poem, and then aside from the tension or the bitterness or anything else, it has this weird jolliness of
yes,
happening on the page, and that double sense of you laugh and say, or both of us, which I love as a moment before even knowing why I love it. But I think it's because to me it feels unpredictable and coming from the dead person and not anticipated because not part of the conversation they could have had if they were alive.
right,
So
yeah, yeah,
anyway, that's something that there are many
good,
things to say, but that's something it makes me want to laugh out loud. And I'm so surprised when that happens because that's not that's not what I think the poem is taking me towards, a
right,
moment of
yeah.
jolliness, and it feels both surprising and right. So,
Well, it's not something I think I realized when I started writing, and it's something that I felt when I was writing, that suddenly uh, the, there's this peculiar way in which there's a perspective in which you have to be dead to get to, and and suddenly for a moment at least you're there, um, and it's weirdly freeing, and it's exhilarating.
Ruth, you had your hand up?
yes. What strikes me in the poem is the extraordinary last stanza. I've never heard a more moving expression of, among other things, what poetry can do and life itself. And also, what strikes me is the poem's gentleness.
Mm.
Uh, and I feel this in other of Frank's poems. And I guess I'm waxing sentimental, but I feel that in your poems, Lloyd, and Alice, I feel that in your work. I can see what I think I just learned something here about understatement, yet filled with great emotion. And it's very moving.
That's great.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Good.
Bill Bennett.
The something that actually moved me in the poem was the line breaks. Um, Phrases that belong together are broken uh, pretty much consistently throughout, which seemed to me like it was about what the poem's about in part. You did read across them as though they weren't there, and I noticed that also. I was curious about what you thought about either the breaks or reading across them.
Well, I think I always feel there's no one way to read the poem. Uh, to read the poem correctly, you have to re-enter the emotions of the poem, the attitudes of the poem, and um, as they emerge, and and the line breaks on the page are uh, in their own way, an attempt to reach that tentativeness that one discovers in the utterance. But there's not only one way to read them, and I certainly have never felt that the end of a line has to mean a pause. There was a moment, I would say, 50 years ago, when everybody seemed to think the end of a line meant a pause, and it was deadly. It was just deadly to poetry, and the poetry readings that reflected that were always events that hurt the poem, any poem, and
I I I think one of the people we learned that from was Lowell, and that Lowell was a master of the enjambed line, of the line break, that you couldn't pause at the end of the line, that you had to rush into the next line. And the fact that there was a line break there was actually loaded with meaning and feeling, uh, and that in some way the line break meant you had to move into the next line even faster
yeah,
rather than slow down and pause at the end of the line. Of course, I completely agree with you about those readings in which poets are reading one line at a time, and
yeah,
no poem is written that way.
I
yeah.
would say on the page, the
Yeah.
line breaks felt like tears.
Hmm.
Oh,
I
well,
I I think, I mean, for me, in a way, the apotheosis of this is you say you knew, I say I knew you knew. The line breaks in there are actually make one speed up a little bit. I knew you knew, um, and the only way, but you need to separate the two news. I knew you knew, um, and the way that's that's part of the discovery of the meaning of that, has to do with feeling out that you have to repeat yourself, but you repeat yourself. The two news are different. I knew you knew, uh, and there's not only one way to read that.
Stephen, you have your hand up.
Oh, I was gonna say, I always feel this about this poem, but most of Frank's poems. I keep thinking of the Horace quote that the art is to hide the art. I feel like the conceit in Frank's poems is that we're somehow eavesdropping on the way a mind thinks,
Uh-huh.
on the grammar of thought. And then it's only in the second, third, and fifth reading that we start to realize all the complicated ways sound is playing inside the poem, what is said and what is left out, what is not said. It's as if we're getting the privilege of being inside somebody else's consciousness. Sometimes you barely are aware that it's a poem. It almost feels like somehow you've just invaded another mind.
Yeah, well, good. Thank you. I like that very much. I hope that's true. Would that it were true more often of my poems. Um,
Denise, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Lloyd. Um, One thing that struck me in this delicate and beautiful poem, full of longing and nostalgia, was especially after I'd never seen a sky so full of stars. It goes into as if the dirt of our lives still were sprinkled with glistening white shells from the ancient seabed. That phrase, the dirt of our lives, stopped me short and is so different from the tone and the language of the rest of the poem that I think it must be very important. And I've been trying to construe it.
I think one thing that's hard to get into a poem is the dirt of our lives, that sense of the kind of daily, the daily texture that is not um, that you can't illuminate, or there, and you're not feeling great insight into, and but that uh, that you have to get that in the poem too, and that's the thing that in a way everything else plays off against. Um, to get the diurnal into a poem is very hard because the danger is simply becoming boring or pedestrian, and but you have to get it in somehow. In a way, the dirt of our lives is very perhaps all too minimal as a way of suggesting the diurnals that one wants an escape from, an illumination out of. I'm sorry, your name is not appearing on my screen, so I don't know who we're talking to. Tell me who you are.
That's Denise Provo, um, Frank.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Um, Something that, oh, Mary, yeah.
I'm so glad Denise brought up that moment because it's one of the stunning moments in the poem for me as well. And I thought, just looking at the beginning of the poem, um, I love the contrast between this wonderfully magical, drunken, starry escapade, and the way that it's broken by that fifth stanza. The fifth stanza really stands out to me as it's the only moment where we really see Jim,
Yeah.
and we see this look of it's excruciating. And I love the way that it points to Jim. I mean, I guess the typical sort of story would be that it's the speaker who is in an excruciating state.
Oh, but
But
he is too.
here we see it's Jim too.
Yeah, yeah.
And I
He
just
doesn't want
love
me
the
to.
way
He
that,
doesn't want me to cross the line,
yeah,
and is actually terrified I will. And I think that was true.
it's a really powerful moment for me. It really brings the emotional, I don't know, the emotional punch of the thing out. And
It's the only line in the poem that begins with punctuation.
true.
That's interesting. Yeah. Dash.
And and so there's something about it that stands out, that there is a turn that we really have to notice, a change in temperature,
Yeah.
a change in observation. Um, Something that no one has mentioned yet is that the poem is in couplets.
Yeah.
And any thoughts about that? Two line stanzas. Am I oh, Heather? Yeah.
Lloyd, you took my question, which is quite all right. But I wanted to ask Frank at what point, if he remembers in the drafting process, he arrived on couplets as sort of the natural form for this poem. I think it's so wonderful because it embodies for us these two young men lying in parallel furrows and that parallel tension between them, both as young men, but now also across the divide of mortality, right? And these parallel existences. And I was even intrigued too that the sort of look of the couplets, most of the couplets are roughly proximate in their length, with the exception of the lines knew, you say there was no place in nature where we could meet, where there's a kind of rhyme in my mind between the distortion or the radical shortness of one line, the radical length of the next, and the fact that there is seemingly no place for these two young men to enjoy each other in the way that each would wish. So I guess my question for Frank is mostly a technical one, which is, Frank, do you remember at what point in the writing of this poem, or maybe you knew from the beginning that couplets would be the form that you would choose?
I don't remember. On the other hand, I'm uh, for now. I don't think the poem could have been written if I didn't have the couplets. So but I don't remember if I ever had any version of these lines that were not couplets. I don't think I did, but because the poem is all transitions, and the way the fact these two line units keep coming but keep changing is crucial, and they allow very different perspectives. Like, for example, the way that dash and that suffocated, fearful look on your face, the way that punctuates the movement, which has not been like that. Um, and that allows, in a way, the poet to use a lot of rhyme. Bitter, we cannot ever, bitter, we cannot have the conversation that in nature and alive we never had, not now, not ever. Uh, it's in a way that those rhymes are broken up and roughened by the line breaks.
Hmm.
But you suddenly can have a lot of them partly because you're writing couplets.
Were is I hadn't noticed that, but were is another rhyme.
Yeah,
All the years we were
Right.
yeah.
undergraduates. And um maybe we could come back to this point later, although someone has already raised it, that the shortest line in the poem is actually our words.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that always surprises me, I mean, surprises me and doesn't surprise me, because of course, Fr Frank, you are almost always writing about your poems are almost always, among other things, about poems and
Mhm.
about writing the poem, and that the poem ends with an acknowledgement of its being a poem.
Mhm.
And how moving that is. That and I don't know, why is that so moving? I'm asking everyone. Catherine, your hand isn't up, but you look like you have something to say.
I don't know that I do. I was actually just stopped. The only is a funny word there because it means only on this page rather than in life. But only on this page sort of diminishes it, but it really aggrandizes it.
Hmm.
Lloyd,
Yes.
it's Ted. Hi.
Oh, hi. Yes,
Hi.
please.
Frank, I'm literally right around the corner from you, about 2 blocks away from where you're
Yeah.
sitting. So I'm feeling particularly close to you on this miserably cold, gray day. My experience of these couplets is that there's a great tenderness in the fact that it's 2 lines, 2 lines, 2 lines, followed by space where memory and loss keeps being collected in that empty space. And I was very surprised when I read this poem because I actually have read, as far as I know, all of your work. And this comment about the tenderness of these couplets leads me to want to ask you a slightly larger question about your work, partially because I'm a student at the moment. In your early work, you often used the page as a place to paint words. You used the whole thing. You often used capital letters that either snuck up on you or were prepared for. I would be interested in what you might say about your understanding of the transition you made between writing those kinds of forms and this kind of form. Thank you.
Well, I know at a certain point, I suddenly felt that all my poems had been à haute voix, in a loud voice, and that there was a whole set of meanings below that, that the capital letters could not suggest. And but it was weird because I've really been writing for years, and I had never thought of them as à haute voix, and suddenly they seemed to me loud and spoken up here, and there was a register below that 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 I also had to speak, and that the meanings that I was feeling inhabited. But it took me a long time. It did not happen right away. I think partly because when I began, I think I had to find a way to get à haute voix on the page, and 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 once I had done that, I realized that there was something beneath that, an intimacy, a simplicity that was absent from what I'd been writing.
Thank you.
Frank, I'd like to introduce you to Selena, whose hand is up. And uh, Selena, where are you in Brazil now by any chance?
No, I'm in Chile now,
You're in
but
Chile.
I have just arrived. So I was in Brazil when I read the poem. I was home at Samambaia. I live where Elizabeth and Lotta lived in that house for the last 40 years, 50 years of my life. And I'm currently really immersed in their life together, in their biography, because I'm doing a documentary about that period of their life. When I read the poem, I could only think about Elizabeth talking to Lotta after her death. And also me right now that I talk to them, and my mother as well, because she was the one that bought the house. People there already passed away, but in a way, for us that we are alive, we are still talking to them and they answer me. So I felt so much in this realm of invisible life and reality and what is considered reality. And your poem just transported me to so many things, you know, the shooting stars beneath the magnetic rock, or beaten and unbeaten. I mean, so many things. I would like to thank you very much, really.
Good, thank you. Thank you for
and-
saying to me. I'm sure this poem could not have been written without knowing Elizabeth's work. And in a way that was sort of marvelous, way in which her last book reached a kind of intimacy of subject matter and speech that even before it had not had. It's very powerful. I mean, Elizabeth's last book is so crucial. And it was
And
one of the great privileges of my life to see her writing those poems.
I I want to interrupt with a little story about Frank and an Elizabeth Bishop poem. And when I um, made my first trip to Brazil, uh, I saw a poem by Elizabeth Bishop that I don't think anyone in this country had ever seen before. And I brought it home. There were two copies of the poem in Brazil, but I couldn't, one was in Elizabeth Bishop's handwriting, which was unreadable, and one was a typed copy. And I copied the typed copy. I was shown the poems and I was allowed to copy them. And I brought them home. And the first thing I did when I got back to Cambridge was call Frank and say, I have a copy of an Elizabeth Bishop poem that you have never seen before, and that probably no one in this country has seen before. And I read him the poem, and Frank loved the poem and then said, I'd like to see it on the page. So I made a copy of the poem and showed it to Frank, and Frank read it. And the next time we talked, Frank didn't like the poem quite as much as he did when I read it to him. And I could tell in his voice that he had some reservation about the poem. And I said, well, what's bothering you? And he said, well, there's something about the turn at the end of the poem. And that I think it was the last couplet, and that I think Elizabeth would have had a dash before this big transition at the very end of the poem. And I thought, well, I thought he was right, and I hadn't really taken that in before. Then I went back to Brazil the following year, and I asked to see the poem in her handwriting. And guess what? The poem in her handwriting had a dash at the beginning of that last couplet. And, I think of this as an example of Frank's uncanny sense of punctuation, but also his ability to read Elizabeth Bishop and to really see and hear what was in her mind, what her thoughts were. Heather, you have your hand up now.
yes, I hope asking two questions isn't hogging too much time, but just dovetailing on your comment, Lloyd, I wanted to share a story of working with Frank on a poem of mine. I was just finishing up my first chapbook, and he had very kindly read it. And I remember receiving an email, I think at 3 o'clock in the morning, from you, Frank, that was titled something like urgent issue. And I opened it thinking, oh no, he's decided he doesn't want to blurb my book after all. But instead, it was a very kind note from you, Frank, in which you encouraged me to think about changing a comma to a dash. And I ended up agreeing with you completely. And it became a better poem, I think, with the dash. And connected to that, Frank, I was actually wondering if you could comment a little bit about the title of the poem, Half Light, in connection with, of course, that's the overall title of your Summa here. But also, there's a way in which in this particular poem, and perhaps I'm misconstruing it, but I think of Half Light in part in tension with afterlife, because this poem for me feels like the most tender of seances in a way. It's a way in which the speaker, in engaging with Jim, has or attains on the page a kind of satisfaction that was never possible in life, either in conversation or physical consummation. And that's tremendously powerful to me, and feels like a kind of corrective almost to the Judeo-Christian notion of an afterlife, that this is something different, but something else is obtained here. So I don't know if there's a question or maybe two questions in that, but I'd love to hear you talk about the title if you wouldn't mind.
Well, it's so, I mean, the traditional way is of thinking of what one wants light. And the way half-light is also saying that all you can achieve is a kind of half-light, that it's not going to be a perfect clarity, perfect light, but that doesn't mean it's not light. And I think one thing that poetry is that place in which you can have a kind of speech you can't have anyplace else. I can't imagine this as a story exactly, because there's a kind of intimacy and the ability to stop and to have it be over. At least the utterance, this utterance is over at the end. And there's no more that I know how to say. And but you very hard to do that in prose. Because it's very hard not to write another paragraph. But poetry, in a way, the fact that it's made up of these recurring couplets, this unit that you take as far as you can take it, and it allows you certain things you would not have otherwise. And I think one of the weird things about the poem is it's talking to someone he has not seen in years. It's not as if all the years in between they've been talking. They weren't. I had not seen Jim in a long time, and once it was clear the limits of what could happen had been reached, we went on to other things. I went on to other things, and he went on to other things. And that's not to say that you don't want to return to what you had, but you in a way are accepting the fact that you're not who you were as an undergraduate. And
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And the poem is that place that you can have a kind of intimacy that you cannot have any other place. You can't have in reality, and you can't enact it in the world, and you can't enact it in. I could not, at least, enact it in prose. But a poem is a place that thing can happen. And it's one reason that one writes poems and one needs poems. And in the past, people needed poems.
Yes. Thank you so much, Frank.
I'm going to call on Wendell, whose hand is up patiently. And but I saw very quickly, someone asked about which Elizabeth Bishop poem that was. And it's an untitled poem that begins, "Dear, my compass still points north." And when?
Well, I was what happened to me, I mean, where the poem struck me in the gut is the line, yes, is the couplet with the line, on the phone, tell me you died almost 9 months ago.
Yeah.
And that's the point that I realized this is an elegy. This is the elegiac tone. And I've been thinking as people talk about the couplets that these are the expressions that come between the sobs as one tries to deal with our mortality and how it separates us from those we love.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it was, yeah, it, thank you, Frank.
One of the things that's so hard about getting older is that people die. One's friends die. It's inconceivable. I mean, it's inconceivable that one's parents die, but then it's even, I'm not saying it's exactly more inconceivable, but it's intolerable that someone I knew as an undergraduate has died. And and it doesn't stop. I guess it'll stop when I die. But because there are many things that are good about getting older, but this is the worst thing about getting older. It's very hard. It's incredibly hard.
Yeah, the last, Yeats's last line, it is time that I make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school till the wreck of the body, the slow decay of blood, the testy delirium, or what worse evil comes, the death of friends, the death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath seem as the clouds of the sky when the horizon fades, or a bird's sleepy cry among the deepening shades.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons that Yeats is just incomparable.
Right.
Those are such great lines. He has words for things that I certainly don't have.
Right. I thought I knew what that meant when I was 23.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And now I appreciate my
Yeah.
ignorance at that age.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great to be introduced to you. I hope I meet you in person one of these days.
Well, I would love to meet you.
That Lloyd will arrange that.
Okay.
Okay. I
I
mean,
could-
Lloyd knows I've been living like a hermit, or more than a hermit. I once I retired and moved from my apartment, which I could not. My apartment was on the third floor, and I had to climb 3 flights, and I could not do it anymore. After I had a stroke, I could not climb the steps. I went through this rather violent wanting to change my life and to cut myself off from everything. And I went through a long period, which I hope I'm coming out of now, where Lloyd will introduce me to people. But I've been living, as I say, I literally don't go out for weeks at a time. And I've loved that, actually. But I think I don't want to do it for the rest of my life. So I hope we meet. Yes, I hope we meet very much.
John.
Yeah, and since we're talking about the elegy aspect of this poem, I don't want to forget the opening of the poem, which sort of prepares the ground for the poem. And the opening, I think, is just absolutely brilliant. It sort of encapsulates all of the grand poetic existential themes to prepare for the poem. And I call it, my personal thing is I call it a Vermeer moment. Nothing to do with really Vermeer, but it just creates the images which constellate what life really is on a physical basis for us. There's the sky full of stars. And of course, Frank has a book called Stardust. And, of course, we are all made of stardust. And it's the dirt of our lives that he's talking about, the dust to dust. So the groundwork is already all set for this thing. And it's really establishes the victory of the moment, what I call the Vermeer moment. And this is where it is firmly established. And it is just, the opening just takes my breath away. It is just so gorgeous in presenting these ideas in this moment.
It's that great. I mean, I could not write the poem until I had figured out how to begin the poem, obviously. And I had to begin the poem with violent contrasts. The the dryness but there was a seabed beneath us that receded long ago. That feeling that the place you're in is not simply the place you're in, but it has a past, and it's been full of luxurious amplitude, and it's gone, and it's gone, but you're aware that it was once different. It was not always as dry as it is now. And it was somehow, and I literally read about the topography, and I read that it was once a seabed, or it was once underwater, and I'm from Central California, and I think of California as being dry and brown, and unlike most people who think of the coast, and they think of the ocean and water and palm trees, and I do not. California for me is not that. It's dry and brown, and it doesn't have enough water, and but that I read that this area that I had been in fact, once was once that there was an abundance of kind of luxuriance of water, and you're kind of aware that it was there, even though you're very aware that it's not there anymore. But it's not that it was never there, but that you're at a moment where things are rich in terms of past, and because if it once happened, it could happen again.
What you're saying now reminds me of the prehistoric references in Lowell's For the Union Dead, the dinosaurs, steam shovels, and
that's right.
That prehistoric. I mean, he's talking about Boston Common, but he's also talking about dinosaurs and
right. That's right.
And Chris, your hand is up.
Well, I just wanted to register my appreciation of the line where language seems to break down for a moment, which is, let me get it just right. Jim, now we cannot ever.
Yeah.
That's
right.
A crucial moment in the poem for me.
And it can't move over into ever what, and it has to stop. Yeah.
Frank, I'd like to introduce you to someone who is maybe almost as far away as Selena, and that's Bill Symes, who is in London.
Oh,
And I, Bill, I don't know if you have anything to say today, but I did want Frank and you to meet, and this is the only way I know how to introduce you.
Uh, Thank you, Lloyd. That's very sweet of you. Well, I've enjoyed the poem a great deal. Um, I do have a few things to say. Some of them are rather pettifogging, I fear, but maybe I'll risk that.
Okay.
Um, I, I agree with other people that the opening is very powerful, but that is um, I was a little bit uncertain about the syntax of the very first two lines, in that we can't quite be certain whether um, that crazy drunken night is adverbial, and then we have a main clause, I maneuvered you, or whether it's a zero relative clause, that crazy drunken night when I maneuvered you. So, and depending on which of those syntactical options one favors, um, uh, different emotional inflections occur. If it's just that crazy drunken night and that's the adverbial, then I maneuvered is, as it were, foregrounded, and it's acknowledging a certain kind of manipulation by the gay man of the man I take to be straight and therefore
yeah.
resistant to romantic overtures.
Yes.
But on the other hand, if it's that crazy night when I maneuvered you, then that's just becomes part of the backdrop. So there's a kind of and there are lots of emotional tensions in that opening, in other senses too. Drunken is in a sense self-exculpatory. If you're drunk, you can't be held responsible for what you're doing. But on the other hand, I maneuvered is acknowledging that there was a kind of calculated manipulation of the possible victim of the romantic assault. So it's really sort of quite complicated. Well, it's in one sense it sounds as casual as could be, but as soon as you begin to scrutinize it, all manner of shades of meaning and subtle nuance hove into view. The other thing I was wanting to say at some point in response to a question you asked ages back, Lloyd, about the movingness of the shift towards self-reflexivity at the end of the poem, is that it seems to me to be conditioned by some proleptic moments early on. You know, when they go outside and they lie down in parallel furrows, the parallel lines are in a sense anticipatory of the inevitability of their not meeting, because parallel lines can only ever meet at infinity. So that in a sense, from that moment on, it's inevitable that the only place where any kind of rapprochement can occur is on the page. And art stepping in and compensating for what life, or what the poem calls nature, can't possibly deliver. That's just a couple of.
That's just right. That's just right. That's what the parallel is doing, and parallel is a sign of what can't happen, as well as what almost could, but can't.
Yes, and I mean, I like the way the nature of the scenario with which we're concerned gradually sort of heaves into view. We sense from maneuvered that this is a gay man attracted towards a straight man, and that's partially confirmed by the suffocated look on the face of the recipient or possible recipient of the romantic overtures, and then it's sort of further confirmed by the fact that he's married, but we're not absolutely certain whether that is a gay man who has, as it were, straightened himself out. I like the way there's a sort of a very controlled plotting of the basic set of events and state of affairs, around which the emotions coalesce and accumulate. Yeah.
Well, it was true. I mean, I knew his wife very well, and she told me he was dead, but on the other hand, she didn't tell me right away. She's telling me something months after it happened, and there's a kind of acknowledgement of 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 all the distance that existed for years, and
Yes. If I can just ask one question,
sure.
Towards the end of the poem, when the meeting which can't happen in life occurs in art, there seems to be a kind of muddling and confusion of tenses. Um, uh, so, for example, in the couplet which begins, "We have not spoken in years," we are half expecting a pluperfect at that point. We had not spoken in
Yes.
years. So that somewhat subverts our expectations with regard to tense. And
Yes.
then later on, we get the our words will be weirdly jolly. At that point, the future tense seems to come
Yes.
from nowhere, and it's almost as if the strange muddle of tenses, in a sense, somehow reflects the impossibility of the meeting which art, in one sense, contrives to deliver.
And can't deliver. I mean,
And yes,
and very much. I mean, and in a way, the poem promises a kind of connection that it knows it can't achieve.
yeah,
Um,
There's a big difference between we had not and we have not. And
yeah,
one of the differences is that we have not is addressed directly to the person.
yeah, yeah,
And that moment of actually speaking directly to the person that has been lost, and how much I think that's a wonderful grammatical moment that is actually one of the most moving moments in the whole poem.
yes, because it's defying the brute reality of his being gone, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
We had not, which we're half expecting would
Right.
acquiesce in the undesired state of affairs, but we
Yeah.
have not refuses it and repudiates it.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also I just one more just literary comment. Bill, something that you just said reminds me of another great poem, Andrew Marvell's The Definition of Love, and the lines, "But ours are love, so truly parallel, though infinite, can never meet."
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
Oh,
chime
yeah.
in with Bill's point about the shifts in tenses there, and to say that it feels to me that in the last 7 stanzas or so, first we launch into the conversation that can't happen. Um, when I tell you, you say, I say, you
Yeah.
say, and then we start to shift out of it, or to find ourselves experiencing the effort to understand that it's impossible with or is this warning? I say what is happening now, and there's a now there, and there's also a now in the last stanza. I say what is happening now is happening only because one of us is dead. And for me, it's like that moment, you'll have a moment like that in a dream, right? When you're talking to somebody that you can't talk to, and part of you is coming out of the dream and says, "Oh, we can talk like this because one of us is dead." And then you laugh and say, "Or both of us." That's somehow still inside, but our words will be weirdly jolly. That will be, now for me, feels like the perspective from outside the
Yeah.
dream or outside the imagined conversation. And then the next stanza moves us again. That light, that light that the imagined conversation shed, that light I now envy exists only on this page. Um, I don't want to try to sort it out, but I feel like that last stanza does remove us all to the page and back to an early point, I think, that maybe Ruth made about what poetry can do to make the place for these conversations. So Bill, I feel that confusion about those tenses and a kind of mystery as I read them in trying to feel what they do. But to me, they make an emotional kind of arc of moving from inside the imagined conversation to an awareness that it's imagined and to a different kind of awareness of the place on the page. Sorry, that was kind of long.
No, that's perfect. I mean, it's very, very true. Um, uh, in a way, one is in the light as long as the poem can go on, and then you can speak as long as you still as you can stay in the poem, and you can't stay in the poem forever. Um,
Ted asked in the chat about the word warning, which we really haven't talked about, and which is a very startling moment in the poem. Um, you say you say this as if you need me to admit something. No place in nature, given our nature, or is this warning? Um, what do you make of that? What's the warning? Frank, do you want to talk about warning?
well, sure. I mean, if if the person speaking the poem is too explicit, uh, he will destroy the possibility of speech. The uh, in a way, it's saying we can't move past the 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 uh, impossibilities that we at the beginning acknowledged, um, and you can't, uh, they're not suddenly going to say we loved each other. They can't. Um, uh, uh,
Yeah.
um, in a way, candor is possible, but only to a certain extent. Um, uh,
Yeah.
well,
Alice?
Yes. I've been wanting to say that one of the things that I find most moving about this is that after saying we never had this conversation, we will never have it, and then we have it.
yeah.
I mean, it doesn't say I imagine a conversation, I pretend. That there's no word like that at all. It just starts. The conversation starts. So
But suddenly
here
we're having it.
it lied. We never have it, but now we're having it. But then it kind of acknowledges, as Frank was just saying, there's another conversation that I could imagine that I'm not going to even, it's not going to be on the page, that I'm not going to imagine, in which we say, yeah, I love you too. That conversation doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So it's as though the poem has incredible power, but then the power is limited. It can't take that final step and make the thing that, I mean, the thing that didn't happen is the conversation, and it can make that happen. But the other thing that didn't happen is the thing that never could happen, and the poem can't do that either.
No, that's right.
It's so moving. It's so moving that for me, the moment when the conversation starts after not happening is incredibly moving, and then, but it can only go so far.
I think that the broken off sentence, now, Jim, now we cannot ever, period, leaves open everything. I mean, it's that staggering moment when you hear someone has died.
Yeah.
We can't have the conversation, we can't have the consummation.
Yeah.
We can't have anything.
Yeah.
And the broken offness leaves us sort of staggering backward. And I felt, we haven't talked about the couplet before. Jim, yesterday I heard your wife on the phone tell me that's different than if you'd said yesterday your wife told me. It puts a distance, like he still can't take it in.
Yeah. It's the memory of having heard something rather than facing the fact.
Rather than hearing it, that's right. That's what I was groping towards. And I just wanted to say one other thing about this poem is so firmly, our feet are planted in old age or old enough to lose friends. You have of course, the passionateness, the lust of youth, but also that comfortable assumption that we're going to live forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have all the time in the world, when we're 90 or 100.
Yeah.
Like the Beatles song, When I'm 60, will you still need me when I'm 64? Is it?
Yeah. Yeah. That's terrible. There's a way in which I did think that somehow at some point we would be able to acknowledge all this. And that never happened. And that's only happening in the poem. And the poem allows it to happen, but the other person is dead, or perhaps we're both dead. And that's why we can do this at all.
June, go ahead.
Oh, June, yeah, hi.
Maybe it's my need for wish fulfillment, but I feel like there is an acknowledgement that this is two gay men. When you get to the warning and what is happening now, and then the other person says, it's only happening because one of us is dead. Oh no, he says, because one of us is dead. And then he says, both of us. I don't know. To me, maybe it's my need that's there.
Well, I mean, of course, the hope of the gay man is the other man really is bisexual, at least, and maybe he was. I don't know. I will never know. And obviously, at some level, I think he was, but at another way, he was not.
I thought there was another breadcrumb earlier, but I don't remember what it was. But that may be just me.
I do think, when especially when one is in one's teens and 20s, early 20s, things are not as defined. Or the other person wants them to be defined, and they are defined, and yet they're not. And if you're the one who's gay, who wants something that is not happening, you think, well, maybe it will happen. It could happen. Maybe it'll happen tonight. but it won't.
Like going on, I think other people's comments, I just wanted to say how moved I was and just the short lines and the emotional of the parallel furrows and their parallel lives and just the beauty and sadness of having this conversation with someone who's not physically there to be able to have that conversation, but knowing that at the end of the day, this is going to be on paper. It touched me so much and it was so beautiful. And I love getting emotional reading a poem, and I feel like this did that, and it was beautiful.
Good, good.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's the Vermeer moment of the poem.
We do have to wind up soon because Marita has to get to work, among other things. Um, any further comments? I think we've
Frank, could you please comment on the title of the poem? How did you reach that? It's so perfect, the title. I mean, for what it is.
Well,
and titles are so difficult.
Yes, well, it's only half light. I mean, it's not. It's not the whole. The whole thing is not illuminated. It's only illuminated as far as I can illuminate it, and it's something I feel very much in my life in terms of everything the book is about. It's not perfect knowledge. It's limited by me and my and the perspective it's coming from, and it's not that there's no light, but it's not God's light. It's not perfect light. It's not the whole truth. It's even if it tries to acknowledge the things that are intractable and not going to change.
Heather, I'm gonna ask you to speak in just a second, but I just was going to convey a thought that because mainly I've seen the title Half Light as the cover of the book, and it's all in capital letters, that I'd forgotten that in the title of the actual poem, it's not half with a capital H and light with a capital L.
Yeah.
But it's light with a lowercase l. And that really makes a difference.
Yeah.
And that it's more half when it's lowercase than when it's than with an uppercase L.
Oh, it would be much more aggressive if it were uppercase L.
Yeah.
I mean, much more assertive about it being the light.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So Heather, yeah.
Thanks, Lloyd. Thank you, Frank. I just wanted to say very quickly here as we draw to a close, Frank, I've had the pleasure of teaching this poem in classes, as I'm sure several of us have. And I just wanted to convey that my students really respond to this poem and respond to the yearning in it with a great deal of appreciation and feeling themselves. So I think this is one of many of your poems that will continue to resonate for generations to come. And
that would be very nice.
It's extraordinary.
I mean, I do think some version of this attachment that is not able to find speech is very common. much more common in a way, even terms like gay or not gay, make it too wooden and too simple. Um, I mean, to be human is to have a huge amount of free floating uh, I don't know what to call it exactly. Uh, emotion that struggles to find an embodiment and and exists in ways that one is bewildered by. And society is a negotiation to um, to find a way to deal with that and not be destroyed by it and not to wholly deny it or wholly acknowledge it.
Thank you. This was extraordinary. It's always extraordinary to hear what Frank has to say about poetry, including his own poetry. And Frank, thank you so much for staying up, if not getting up, this early. And thank you for joining us. And Marita, thank you again for uh, allowing these discussions to continue. And thank you everyone for participating and even participating in silence. Uh, and look forward to next time. This is going to be it's going to be hard to find another poem that will allow us to allow you to speak with such feeling and intelligence. As I've told you before, I I I I pick poems that I think I know inside and out, and I always learn something from you about those poems. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
And
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so